Excise taxes on products that harm their users and others can change behavior and save costs while raising funds for critical health programs. Yet alcohol taxes are at historically low levels in the United States. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Arthur Robin Williams, an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University and a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Williams has written a perspective article about taxes on alcohol. Dr. Williams, what's known about the health effects of various levels of alcohol use?
There's been this widespread understanding, and which now is apparent is a misunderstanding that alcohol can be cardioprotective. And the idea there was that perhaps someone has had a glass of wine with dinner. If they were to have myocardial infarction afterward, that they would have some sort of protection against necrosis or cell injury following the ischemic event. That this was the sort of the belief. And looking at redoing studies with better methodology, what has become apparent is that what part of what led to this misunderstanding was that studies of alcohol consumption often would include people who were not drinking because of alcohol use disorder, because of alcohol related liver damage, cardiac issues, where alcohol consumption would be contraindicated. By rerunning studies, including populations based on levels of consumption, identifying who's not drinking because they've actually had alcohol related harms, it became apparent that drinking really at any level is unsafe. And every additional drink, every additional sort of tranche of consumption was associated with greater risk of morbidity and mortality.
And of course, that's for the person who's consuming the alcohol. What are the effects of alcohol consumption on a societal level, including people who don't drink alcohol?
You can think about different substances, and this is where the DSM may have the same 11 diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. They're not tailored to the drug of choice, so to speak. And when we think about alcohol, it's more similar to stimulants or psychostimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, where there can be a lot of externalizing behaviors. The counterexample would be something like cannabis, where there's actually a lot of internalizing behaviors, meaning someone who's addicted to cannabis often is withdrawing from society, is the amotivational syndrome picture of being stuck on the sofa watching shows or with the munchies or things, very broadly speaking. But when we think about alcohol, there's tons of violence, and that's not just brawls in the local pub, but also self-harming behaviors, even suicide attempts that are at greatly elevated levels. I don't remember the exact numbers, but years ago I read a study and it was something like a person who's consumed more than 4 drinks is 100 times as likely to wind up in the emergency room, something along those lines. And it just speaks to how dangerous heavy consumption in general, but heavier consumption can be. And there are implications, of course, with motor vehicle accidents, other kinds of injuries or impulsive behaviors that can threaten the individual user, but also the people around them.
How have patterns of alcohol consumption and public attitudes about alcohol changed in the United States in recent years?
This is very complex and it's not unidirectional. One of the points I make in the article is that several things are happening at once. So I quoted some recent research that suggests as many as a quarter of American adults are participating in dry January, this idea that they're not going to be drinking for the month of January. And at the same time, if you look at women, for instance, rates of binge drinking among women are now approaching that of men, which historically has never happened in the United States. Binge drinking or sort of extra binge drinking, super high levels where people are drinking 10, 20 drinks in a day is occurring in a way that it wouldn't have occurred in prior generations. And yet, at the same time, there are a lot of people who are sober curious. They're thinking, I may not have an alcohol addiction per se, and yet I'm interested in reducing or even cutting alcohol out of my life. And there's a lot of interest in alternative substances, whether it's cannabinoids or the use of mushrooms or all sorts of things. This sort of plethora, this explosion of intoxicants or mild intoxicants that people are seeking because they think they may be safer than alcohol.
So, despite concerns about the effects of alcohol use, you write in your perspective article that while cigarette taxes are at all-time highs, alcohol taxes are at all-time lows in the United States. How have alcohol tax rates changed over time, and how do current rates compare with those taxes on cigarettes?
If we think about alcohol taxes in the modern era, they really began after Prohibition ended, so in the 30s. And if you look decade over decade, in the 30s, 40s, alcohol taxes overall in the United States were increasing. And then they really plunged from the mid-century through today. And when we think about beverage alcohol in the US, this is more or less a $300 billion industry. So there's a ton of revenue in this, a ton of invested interests and stakeholders. And inevitably, there's been plenty of lobbying over the years. There was a recent NIH study that had been proposed and funded that was canceled because industry was heavily involved in the study. And so there are all sorts of reasons why people don't want to be taxed to begin with, but also the industry doesn't want to face taxes that could potentially undermine sales.
You also say in your article that demand for these sin goods has been shown to exhibit substantial price elasticity. How would increasing taxes on alcohol be expected to affect both alcohol consumption and then public health?
In general, in terms of a consumer good, the more that you tax it, you're going to drive down consumption. And some things are more elastic in that relationship, and other things are more inelastic. So, toilet paper, we think of as a classic inelastic good. People need it. They're going to keep buying it, even if the price goes up. Eggs, to a little bit of a lesser extent. But when you think about something like alcohol, it's much more elastic in terms of as the price goes up, it will disproportionately drive down consumption. It's a bit of a luxury good, which is part of the connotation with an excise tax, that these are an extra level of taxes that may be layered onto goods, whether it's a yacht or a case of wine, that aren't necessarily needed on a day-to-day basis. The price elasticity of sin goods like alcohol and cigarettes, this is even more pronounced for youth. Price elasticity is even more pronounced for youth and young adults who have limited budgets typically. And these, of course, are the people that we're most concerned about, not just in terms of rates of car crashes and psychiatric sequelae, but also in terms of the risk of developing nicotine or alcohol use disorder. So there are a lot of reasons to not just have age restrictions, but also to be mindful of the cost of these goods.
And what, if any, are the potential negative effects of increasing taxes on alcohol?
One point I make in the article is that an excise tax, like a sales tax, is inherently a regressive tax. And I've been in these conversations for about 20 years. And over those years, one of the concerns that's often expressed is that increasing alcohol taxes will disproportionately impact low income consumers. And frankly, one of the examples, for instance, that may come up is you think about construction workers, or we have all sorts of workers who might enjoy a beer after a long day at work. And there's an element to this where I think, especially when there are other connotations baked into that, that there's a bit of a let them eat cake narrative to this, where, well, why wouldn't someone deserve to have a drink after a hard day's work? And I think what's problematic about that is that, yes, if we increase taxes, it will be disproportionately felt by lower income households, whatever the good is. But ultimately, what is the point of taxation? And part of what has emerged and part of what motivated the Surgeon General's office to suggest that there should be cancer warnings added to the labels of alcohol beverage containers is that it's very clear now that alcohol consumption, much like the way the public understands that cigarette consumption, is inherently harmful. There is no safe amount. That would be the motivation behind raising taxes more to historic norms rather than these suppressed rates of taxes, to reflect how harmful alcohol is, both to the user, but also to society.
Finally, what do you see as the next step for adjusting alcohol taxes? Is federal action likely in the current political climate?
I would be dismayed if anyone made a prediction with confidence of what is likely or possible in the current political climate. One point I make in the article is that the Fed, so to speak, can have an excise tax on alcohol nationally, but states and municipalities also have the power and do very actively layer on additional taxes, especially for cigarettes. And that is something that historically has happened for alcohol. And so we don't necessarily need federal level intervention. There are various ways that we could explain to the public in terms of helping them have information to make healthier choices. And to an extent, taxation may be one of the levers for helping to guide consumer choice.
Thank you, Dr. Williams.